Question. Before getting to know your books and websites, I wandered around many different spiritual teachings for a long time. But my experience with them were not so successful, and even my internal feeling about them was anxious and based on doubt. Maybe my response to them was from my internal fear and anxiety. Recently, just before meeting your works, I got to know the concept of Christianity from Rudolf Steiner's works. Specifically, Rudolf Steiner's notions of Ahriman and Lucifer deeply influenced and inspired me. But I feel hard in how to connect Rudolf Steiner's huge amount of works and Ascended Masters' teachings in a coherent manner. For example, my question is, may I understand that the concept of Lucifer and Ahriman by Steiner are two extreme aspects of the dualistic worldview in your and Ascended Masters' teachings? To be more honest, my deeper ultimate inquiry is, may I trust Rudolf Steiner's teachings? Is he a part of the Ascended Masters or just a fake instructor teaching the mixture of 90% of truth and 10% of falseness? Regarding this question, what do the Ascended Masters say? Well, I think this question is interesting because it raises this larger question of how can we, who have studied different spiritual teachings, how can we reconcile the different teachings that are out there? I mean, if you look at people I have met on the spiritual path, almost everybody has studied more than one spiritual teaching. And if you look at the amount of spiritual teachings that are out there, it's overwhelming, it's bewildering, it's confusing, and to some degree the amount of teachings is to confuse people, but on the other hand, it's also because different groups of people need different teachings, and there are different stages of the spiritual path where people need different teachings. So I look at all the people I met on the spiritual path, and most people have studied a variety of teachings, and most people have some trouble, reconciling them. So let me comment on that first. What do you do when you have studied various spiritual teachings? You feel they have some value for you. You feel you were attracted to those teachings because you needed to get something out of it. But now you found another teaching and it doesn't quite, jive with the other one. It's hard to translate directly. And what I would say about that is that when I was younger, I was very much into the, you might say, rational, linear, analytical mind. And I was very, very concerned about consistency. There had to be consistency between spiritual teachings, or even within a spiritual teaching. There couldn't be contradictions in the same spiritual teaching. And I'm not saying that isn't important, but it's not nearly as important to me now as it was 40 years ago. And the reason for this is, of course, that my intuition has gotten better. And when you have a stronger intuition, it's almost like it goes hand in hand. You walk the spiritual path, you gradually develop your intuition. You are better at listening to your intuition. And but the intuition also makes you less dependent on the outer mind, because many of us who grew up in these modern societies, we have been brought up to rely so much on that rational linear mind. And on the spiritual path, that will only take us so far. I mean, it is important to have both intuition and a rational understanding, but you have to have the stronger intuition, because the rational understanding, as I've said in some of my non-duality videos, the linear mind can argue for or against any topic and can come up with arguments that seem convincing depending on what you choose to be the one thing you don't question. That's why I also have these How the World Works videos where I talk about how the mind can become a closed system. So we have to be aware of that. So I think on the spiritual path you have to learn to trust your intuition more and more. So what I would say, what I have come to is that, first of all, I'm not as attached to the outer mind. I don't think that if you take two spiritual teachings that they should be completely compatible, and there must not be any contradictions between them. And I don't think either that if you take two spiritual teachings and see there is a contradiction, that necessarily means that one of them has to be false and the other has to be true. And the reason for this is that I have come to realize that, first of all, there is no absolute truth that can be given in the material world. We are on a dense planet. Language is a major barrier. Words can always be interpreted. So for the spiritual teachers in the ascended realm, even they can't give us a teaching that is an absolute truth, because people can do all kinds of things with it, with their minds, once it's put into words. So I have come to become less dependent on the words, and I have come to realize that the real purpose of a spiritual teaching is to give us these intuitive breakthrough experiences, these aha experiences, and ultimately to shift our consciousness to higher and higher levels. In other words, the real purpose of a spiritual teaching isn't to give us intellectual understanding, it's to shift our consciousness. And that's why I'm saying, when I was young, the rational mind was very important for me. And when I studied a spiritual teaching, I would constantly, my outer mind would be going, comparing this to what I already knew, looking for inconsistencies, all of these things. I'm always analyzing. And now it's much more that I just read a teaching and I look for that intuitive breakthrough, the intuitive experience. And it's that experience that's important, not so much the outer teaching. So what I would say is, yes, you can find any number of spiritual teachings out there that are sometimes very, very extensive, very, very elaborate. Rudolf Steiner is just one of them. Rudolf Steiner came from the whole theosophical movement at the time. He split off from Blavatsky, but Blavatsky also has a huge amount of work. And if you start with a linear mind to compare them to ascended master teachings, for example, it's very difficult, because you get lost in saying, here's a statement that seems, from this teaching, that seems to contradict a statement from the other teaching. But the way to resolve it is to say, I was attracted to this particular teaching for a reason. And it gave me, as the question describes, it gave me some breakthrough experiences, some intuitive experiences, and that was what I needed from that teaching. And if I now found another teaching that appeals to me now at my present level, then I just focus on that teaching. I don't think you need to, you see what I'm saying? I don't think you need to really have this one-on-one correspondence. This particular teaching or this particular statement in that teaching means the same as in that teaching. It just becomes, at some point, it just becomes too time-consuming as far as I'm concerned. So you just say, I found, in this case, Rudolf Steiner's teachings for a reason. And I studied them, and I had some good experiences from it, and perhaps there are still experiences you can have from it. So you just need to look for those experiences and not necessarily try to make it all consistent. In terms of the question here about Lucifer and Ahriman in Steiner's teachings. Now, I'm not an expert on Steiner's teachings, but the little I have read on it, I would say I think it's true what you are saying, that you can consider Lucifer and Ahriman as two aspects of the dualistic worldview. I always, when I look at a teaching, especially some older teachings, I always see that, I don't take them literally. For example, Steiner talks about the incarnation of Lucifer 3000, I think it was 3000 BC, was it? A long time ago. And there's a coming incarnation of Ahriman. So he's talking like these are two people or two spiritual beings that are going to actually take physical incarnation. I don't look at it that way. I don't necessarily think it has to be interpreted that way. I think that they represent different stages or elements of consciousness. So you can certainly in Steiner's work see that Lucifer could be said to represent this, as I've talked about, the linear, analytical, rational mind that wants to make everything rational, consistent, put it on a timeline, also put it on true and false, the dualistic scale. And then Ahriman can be said to represent what you also see in the world now, they're focused on materialism. And in a sense, you could say that the rational teaching was what led us to become so focused on the material realm, because the rational mind wants to have everything based on evidence and something the rational mind can know, and not on intuition, for example, that can't be quantified by the rational mind. So, but I think you could even step further back based on Ascended Master teachings, because the Masters have talked about different phases that humankind goes through. So I think you could say that if you go back in time, most people were in this state of what we might call the mythological state of mind, where they didn't take things literally. It was very interesting for me to hear this concept that fundamentalist Christianity is actually a consequence of the scientific age. It's a reaction to scientific thinking, because the scientific thinking takes everything literally. But before the advent of science and rational thinking, people didn't take the Bible literally. They took it as an allegory, as a myth, as something that was meant to inspire, but they didn't necessarily think that everything had to be taken literally. But then came science, where everything is now taken literally, and this is what the Christian fundamentalists used to say: now we have to take the Bible literally, and we have to interpret everything literally. So what I'm saying is that if you look at this in a broader context, and the Ascended Masters, they have talked about this. I can't remember any specific place, but they talked about it around in different teachings, that humankind is on this growth path. And first there was the mythological, where we related to the spiritual realm in a mythological way. And you could compare this to the emotional body. And if you go any further back, of course, you can see that people were very physical. They had a concept of a god, but they had to have some kind of idol, some kind of statue, for example, that they were worshipping. So then came the mythological age, where people were more based on feelings, the emotional body. And there was a lot of fear in that also. And then the rational thinking was meant to take us up to the mental level, where now we are relating to the spiritual realm through the mental mind. And then, of course, the challenge we are facing right now is that we have to go up to the identity level and start connecting more directly with the spiritual realm, because we see ourselves as spiritual beings, not as human beings, but who are trying to be spiritual, but as spiritual beings who are just in a human body. And so we might say every age has its challenges, and there's always a challenge when you're transitioning from one to the next, because you might say the challenge of the rational age is to not go into materialism, but to step up to the identity level, which means we step up to intuition. Instead of trying to work everything out with a rational mind, we become more intuitive. And so you could certainly, in my view, you could see it that way, and the many spiritual people today who are building our intuition, they are, striving to step up to that identity realm where we relate to the spiritual realm, not through some construct of the mind, not through some mental image, not even through an outer teaching, but we seek a direct inner experience. That's why the Ascended Master has said many, many times that the goal of them giving teachings is not to have us focus on the outer teaching, but to use the teaching as a springboard to have a direct experience of their presence, their being, their consciousness. So, and this has always been there for me. I have over the years become much, much better at looking beyond the outer teaching and reaching for an experience of the consciousness that gave the teaching, the being, the spiritual being that gave the teaching. I will say, though, just to round it off, that if you go to the website ascendedmasteranswers.com, you can search on Rudolf Steiner. You'll find a few comments. They are short. So I'll just summarize it here. What the Masters have said is that Rudolf Steiner is not an Ascended Master today. He wasn't working with the Ascended Masters. He was working with beings in the mental realm. And these were not beings that were malicious, but they were just, they were not at the ascended realm. So they had a limited view, a limited perspective based on looking at everything with the mental mind and trying to explain everything in this more rational, linear way. So that's what they've said about it. But you can, as I said, go on there, search and find what they said exactly.